I am honored to have on the phone lines uh, candidate for the state Supreme Court, Judge Susan Crawford. Good morning to you. How are you?
Yeah, good morning, Earl.
It is an honor and a privilege to have this opportunity to have, a couple moments with you. Tell us a little bit about Judge Susan Crawford.
Oh, thanks, Earl. It is my honor to be here. Let me just say that first. I am a judge in the Circuit Court in Dane County. I've been on the bench since 2018. I grew up in Chippewa Falls in western Wisconsin, one of four kids. I started my career as a prosecutor at the Wisconsin Department of Justice, did that for many years, and worked hard to make sure that I was doing justice for the people in our state and crime victims and holding people accountable and making sure that the laws were interpreted correctly. I then later in my career was in private practice and often was working to make sure that I was fighting for people whose rights had been taken away from the government. So kind of from the other side, when school teachers' rights were taken away by the government, I was fighting for them in court to protect them. I represented Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin and their doctors to stand up for women's rights to access health care and did a lot of work for our voting rights. So I've had a really broad career and I've always really been focused on protecting people under our laws.
So I've often wondered, how old were you when you realized that this is the line of work that you wanted to do?
You know, I was pretty grown up, Earl. When I was a kid, I didn't know any lawyers and I didn't know any judges. And if you'd asked me when I was 10 years old, 12 years old, what I wanted to be when I grew up, I probably would have said I want to be a teacher because my teachers were my heroes. And that was what I aspired to do, was to be like them. And after I finished college, I actually went to graduate school to try to pursue that career. And ultimately, after a year or so, I just had some second thoughts about that and some doubts and was feeling really pulled to pursue a career that was more about engaging in the big issues of the day and solving problems for people and protecting people's rights. And ultimately that led me to law school and led me to the career I've had since then. So I would say I was, in my mid-20s before I came to that decision.
So if you're just joining us, I'm joined by a candidate for the state Supreme Court, Judge Susan Crawford. I guess I want to ask you before we move any further.
Yeah.
There's a guy in office right now who is doing everything he can, to destroy the judicial system that you and many others hold sacred. Your thoughts about what's happening right now and the challenges that the judicial system faces under President Donald Trump?
Yeah. Well, Earl, I think what people should understand and what should give people hope is that the judicial branch is an entirely separate branch of government from the executive branch, and the courts exist to protect people's rights under our laws and under our Constitution. And the courts provide a firewall when the executive branch, and that's the president at the federal government level or the governor at the state government level, and Congress or the legislature, when they take rights away from people that are vested under our Constitution, we go to the courts to protect people. And it presents that kind of firewall to protect people's rights. So that's why courts are even more important today than ever.
So let's talk about the state Supreme Court, and the position that you are running for right now.
Yeah.
The way, tell us a little bit about cases and how you guys determine what cases. Let's say you're fortunate enough to become the next Supreme Court justice. How is it determined what cases are the things that you guys will hear?
Yeah, that's a great question, Earl. So The Wisconsin Supreme Court is unique among all the other courts in our state in that they do get to pick and choose which cases to take up. Parties, lawyers can present petitions from cases that have gone through the lower courts asking the Supreme Court to take up a case, and the Supreme Court votes, and if at least 3 of the justices decide that the case presents issue of statewide importance that merits consideration by the top court, then the Supreme Court's going to hear that case. So you see the Wisconsin Supreme Court making decisions in many cases that affect our most basic rights and freedoms, our democracy, our right to vote. There are 2 cases in the Supreme Court this term on women's rights to make decisions about their own bodies and their reproductive choices. Every season, every year, there are important cases that the Supreme Court's deciding that are going to affect all of our rights and freedoms. So that's why this race is so important, and it's why it's so important to make sure that that court stays fair and impartial and isn't taken over by, extreme political people like my opponent, who is somebody who has a long history as a partisan politician, and I believe is trying to inject partisan politics into our Wisconsin Supreme Court.
You just stole my thunder. Because I was going to ask you about partisan, politics, and the Supreme Court is clearly a place that should not enter into the thought processes of the justices, but we know that hasn't been the case over the last decade and a half, almost 2 decades. So in the face of that, how do you resist that? How do you push back? How do you stay away from that fray?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty straightforward for me, Earl. I've always been fair and impartial in any case that I hear now as a circuit court judge, and that's the same thing that I'll do as a justice on the Supreme Court. And my approach is to, first of all, make sure I get the facts right, because the truth is really important in our justice system at all levels of court. Then I make sure that I understand the law and am interpreting and applying the law correctly. And I also am careful to consider that what's really at stake in any case is the lives of the people who are in front of me. I'm not making decisions to announce some kind of abstract principle to the world. I am making decisions that resolve real disputes between real people and affect people's lives. And I think it's very important for judges to look at the context of their decision. And on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, their decisions end up being precedent or set rules for the rest of the courts in the state to follow. So it's important for the Wisconsin Supreme Court justices to consider how those rules are going to be applied in future cases. But I approach each case with an open mind. I don't prejudge or pre-decide cases. Again, unlike my opponent, who has been out openly announcing his views on various cases pending in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is prejudicial to the parties in those cases and just an improper thing to do as a judge. You got to stay open-minded. You got to remain impartial until all the evidence is in, all the arguments have been made by the attorneys, and only then do I make a decision.
855-752-4842. My guest is Judge Susan Crawford. She's a candidate for the state Supreme Court. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, this is arguably going to be the most expensive Supreme Court race in the history almost of the nation. Your thoughts?
Well, I wish it were otherwise, let me say that. But I am going to make sure that my campaign has the resources that we need to communicate my message to the voters, that voters know who I am, that they understand that I'm doing this to be a fair and impartial justice on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and that I'm going to work hard for their votes. And, unfortunately, my opponent pledged very early on. He got into the race way back in November of 2023 and immediately said that he'd be seeking national support from right-wing political groups to back his campaign, and that's what we're up against, is that kind of partisan approach. So I've got a great campaign team, and they will make sure we've got the resources that we run to have a level playing field and get the word out and help voters to understand what's at stake in this race.
Well, I'll tell you, I am honored to have you on the airways. It certainly won't be the last time. It's a pleasure to get to put a voice to the face that I've seen, and on in many places, and so we'll be certainly having dialogue as this progresses.
Well, thank you so much, Earl. It was a pleasure, and I'd love to come back sometime.
Certainly. All right. Thank you very much. That's candidate for the state Supreme Court, Judge Susan Crawford.